Bonjour à tout le monde. Pour mes amis francophones, donc je vais dire bonjour en français. People who came here from abroad probably haven't realized yet that Canada is a bilingual country. We have 2 official languages, less than in India that we were told has 20, but we have 2. Some of those who know me may wonder what I'm doing here. John Smithson mentioned that I had a book with Wynne Godley on monetary economics, so that's a little bit far away from environmental issues. But I was asking myself why, and I thought, oh, maybe that's because I wrote 2 papers on consumer theory and ecological economics. Anyway, some of the questions we will deal today are, well, first, most people would think that we should have more growth to solve our problems of employment, or unemployment, I should say, problems related to poverty, income inequality, public deficits, public debt. Perhaps we'll hear about this later tonight. More growth to improve our social programs, health, and so on. But on the other hand, we have people who are in ecological economics or environmental economics who are telling us the opposite. They say that, well, maybe we should have less growth. Some say zero growth, and others say even degrowth, meaning negative growth. In fact, there's a 4th conference on degrowth, which is to be held in September in Leipzig. So there seems to be some trade-off. However, perhaps innovations or technological progress can alleviate this trade-off. So can innovations help us with respect to problems tied to non-renewable resources or to global warming or climate change? Also, some people argue that with ecological friendly investments that indeed we could help resolve problems of unemployment rather than make them worse. Also, we may wonder whether innovations or technological progress may in the end have a negative effect on the economy. For instance, we can think of nuclear power, which was certainly considered recently to be an improvement in technology. However, in the end, we had Fukushima, and also at some point we thought biofuels was a good idea, but then it led to higher food prices. In any case, so the order will be the one which is not indicated there. So the first one to go will be Peter Victor, and then we will follow the alphabetical order. I just want to say why Peter is first. It's because he told me yesterday that he was reading my book with great attention, so I thought he should go first because of that. So Peter is especially well known for his book, Managing Without Growth. And so I welcome him to talk.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see you here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about this topic about innovation and environment, and to share the podium with this distinguished panel. Now, as many of you will realize, Schumpeter's name always comes up at INET conferences, usually in relation to the concept of creative destruction. But I want to begin my presentation by invoking Schumpeter's name in relation to another concept, the pre-analytic vision, which he defined in the following way. Analytic effort is of necessity preceded by a pre-analytic cognitive act that supplies the raw material for the analytic effort. So in other words, your pre-analytic vision is the worldview that you adopt in advance of performing analysis. Now, I mention this because in order to come to grips with the environmental costs of innovation, it is essential to start with a pre-analytic vision which includes the environment and the economy. I suppose that's obvious, but it's still worth saying because it is not the pre-analytic vision from which most economists start. Even at this conference on new economic thinking, several speakers have used ecological terms, but to describe the economy, not the environment. We've heard mention of the economic ecosystem, the ecology of expectations, the food chain, but little about real ecosystems and the natural world. You see, it's as if economies can exist quite independently of the environment in which they are embedded. So let me offer you a different pre-analytic vision, one in which the economy, both real and financial, is understood as a subsystem of the biogeosphere, or biosphere for short. As such, the economy is embedded in the biosphere, which provides all of the materials and energy required by the economy, serves as a depository for all its wastes, and provides the locations for the economy to exist. Starting here, we can draw upon not only all the useful concepts arising from various schools of economic thought, but also on concepts drawn from the natural sciences. For example, the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which tell us that materials and energy are used in all economic processes and then disposed of, and that energy, in particular, suffers a decline in its capacity to do useful work whenever we use it. So now that I've given you a hint of my pre-analytic vision of an economy embedded in the biosphere, I'm going to present just five propositions that arise from it relating to the environmental costs of technological innovation. The summary of my story is that these propositions, if true, lead to the conclusion that the environmental costs of innovation are generally unavoidable and largely unpredictable, they are large and growing, and to address them adequately will likely require a transformation of the economy, real and financial. So I'm going to start with the first proposition, that environmental costs of technological innovation are largely unavoidable. And to make this case, I'm using Barry Commoner's 4 laws of ecology. His first was that everything is connected to everything else. And that wasn't just a statement he was making about ecological systems, but it was about social systems, economic systems, and ecological systems. All are interrelated. So what that means is that when you make a change in any part of one of those systems, you can expect there to be repercussions, even if you can't trace them, in the system that you've made the change in, or any of the other systems to which that system's connected. His second law is that everything must go somewhere. This is, in a sense, the first law of thermodynamics. When we bring materials and energy into the economy, we process them, we use them, we add value, but in the end, they all are emitted back into the environment as waste. And the more we bring in, the more we discharge. It's a big problem, and there is no way. We talk about throwing things away. There is no such place. Thirdly, his law of ecology says that, or his third law of ecology says that nature knows best. Now, what that means is that we are the recipients, the beneficiaries of billions of years of evolution, and many things have been tested along the way. Particular kinds of combinations of molecules, for example, that may or may not have been useful and survivable, didn't survive. And now we find ourselves creating new combinations of materials and putting them into the environment, into nature, and in such a way that often nature can't degrade them, can't decompose them, and sometimes bad things happen. The fourth one, and this is as much a law of economics, I suppose, as it is of ecology, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every gain comes with some sort of loss somewhere. Every beneficial use almost always involves some loss somewhere else. So that's my first proposition, that it's impossible to conceive, I think, of technological innovations that don't have some environmental costs of one sort or another. Secondly, we are presented with the difficulty that the science that has given rise to so much of the wonderful technology that we've all benefited from is of a particular kind. It's almost always conducted in the laboratory, where the main mode of operation is to hold everything constant except the one thing that you're interested in, and then to try to see what difference it makes when you change the one thing that you're interested in. Of course, that's not really necessarily extendable when we move out into the real world, where we're unable to hold just the one thing constant. And so what we find is that kind of science is very, very limited in its capacity to anticipate the environmental costs that come from the changes that we make to the environment. And there are numerous examples of where we've fallen short. The one that's up on this slide is the well-known example of DDT, when it wasn't appreciated in advance that DDT could bioaccumulate through the biosphere and ultimately poison animals up the food chain, so that the eggshells of their offspring were thin, and the offspring had a much harder chance of surviving. I'm always looking around for useful information sources, which is one of the reasons I was reading Mark's book. But I didn't realize that I was going to draw upon our lunchboxes for this conference for a couple more examples. I don't know if any of you read the lunchbox. So I'm going to give you two more examples of where environmental innovations had environmental costs. The United Nations, this comes right from the lunchbox. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization has estimated that 70% of the global fish population is fully used, overused, or in crisis. That's got a lot to do with, of course, the fishing technologies that have been introduced over the last number of decades. Here's one about irrigation, having increased the world's surface of arable land by 20%, and how irrigated land produces 3.5 times more crops than non-irrigated land. But also, it says, unfortunately, irrigation can also alter the natural water levels of rivers, create soil erosion, hurt the shipping and fishing industries, and even cause farming problems for indigenous populations who rely on farming and livestock for survival. So it's not difficult to come up with numerous examples of where technology has caused environmental costs that were not properly anticipated in advance. My third principle is that a general reduction in environmental costs requires an absolute reduction in throughput and land transformation. Throughput is just a term that I use and others use as a summary term for all of the materials that flow through an economy. Now, the chart that you see on the right describes global materials extraction from 1900 to 2005. So this is a global picture. And it divides these materials into the 4 categories: biomass, fossil energy carriers, all the fossil fuels, ores and industrial materials, and construction materials. And if you look carefully at that graph, for the first half of the 20th century, there was a very gentle increase in the total global extraction of materials. It just about doubled between 1900 and 1950, 1955. But then in the second half of the 20th century and into the early part of this century, look at that massive rate of increase, a 6-fold increase in the second part of the century. Now, if we're bringing all of this material into the economy, it should not surprise us that we're now observing more and more impact resulting from the disposal of these materials at the global level. And the chart on the right, taken from an article that's quite well known, published in Nature in 2009, shows around the perimeter 9 significant problems, global problems, or sometimes local problems, but they're happening all over the place, so we still refer to them as global problems, such as freshwater problems. Now, the scientists who put this together identified what they called the safe operating space for humanity. They did it item by item, so they worked out what they thought was a safe amount of greenhouse gases to put into the atmosphere. And that is represented by the green circle in the middle of the diagram. But you'll see that the red marker shows that by their estimation, and of course many others, we've gone beyond the safe operating capacity of the Earth to sustain us. The other 2 areas where the red is showing quite outstandingly is with the interference with the nitrogen cycle and the loss of biodiversity. So I always put these 2 together because I think it's so important to understand that if we insist and we can't find a way forward economically of running our economies without reducing the amount of materials that we're bringing in, we can expect the kind of problems illustrated by the picture on the right to get worse, not better. The 4th proposition: decoupling economic growth from throughput and land use is necessary, but it's not sufficient, and it's certainly not easy. So we have there an equation in the red letters saying that throughput equals GDP minus throughput divided by GDP. That has to be true. Now, what does innovation do to the right-hand side that might help us on the left-hand side? Well, innovation, of course, can help GDP change. A number of speakers have talked about the importance of innovation in helping GDP grow. And innovation can also affect the ratio of throughput to GDP. And so it comes into play in both of those, with respect to both of those variables. But the point I want to make is that if we are going to see an absolute reduction in throughput, the reduction in throughput per unit of GDP that we require to achieve any specified reduction in total throughput is greater the faster is the rate of economic growth. Now, that's illustrated by the graph on the left-hand side. On the bottom axis of that graph, it shows you the rate of economic growth ranging from 0 to 4%. And on the upright axis, it has the rate of reduction in intensity, i.e. throughput per unit of GDP. And I've just posited, let's suppose we want a 50% reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases or any other measure of throughput by 2050. Well, you can see that if the economy doesn't grow at all, the rate of reduction in intensity would have to be 2% a year for 36 years. That's quite a demanding rate of reduction. We don't generally see that. But if we have a rate of economic growth of, say, 2% a year, we need a 4% rate of reduction in intensity. And if we want an economic growth of 4% a year, it's almost a 6% annual rate of reduction in intensity that we need in order to get the 50% reduction in emissions. So it's very important, to my mind, to understand that to meet any environmental target which requires a reduction in throughput, the faster the economy grows, the faster we've got to make the changes in order to reach that target. Now, why am I guess, on the pessimistic end of the spectrum about whether we are likely to achieve that in the future? Well, all I can really do is look to the past, and the graph on the right shows material footprint decoupling in all the OECD countries from 1990 to 2010. So what the blue line shows is how the GDP of the OECD has risen in real terms from 1990 to about 2008. And it's got about 55% greater. That's why the blue line goes up to about 0.55. Now, if you just measure the direct materials consumption of the OECD, which in other words is the materials taken from the OECD's own land, the materials that are imported, but subtract the materials that are exported because somebody else has used those, you see the red line. We call that relative decoupling. The domestic material use of materials, domestic use of materials hasn't risen as fast as GDP, but it hasn't gone down in absolute terms. But the green line is the troublesome one because this is based on a calculation of the materials embedded in all of the products consumed in the OECD countries. So the materials embedded, but not directly exported, but embedded in the products that the OECD has imported, when you add all that up, there's been absolutely no decoupling at all. This is not good news and doesn't augur well for the future. So I come to my fifth proposition. And it's about investment, because the way I understand investment, real investment, is it is investment that provides the link between the present and the future. If we want a different future, we need a different pattern and different quantity of investment today. And so what this graphic shows, and I didn't draw it, unfortunately the artist's name doesn't seem to be showing on the screen, but it shows there's a choice to be made. We can pursue economic growth as it's traditionally been practiced, and that will take us in one direction. I don't think it's a very happy one. Or we can talk about other measures of progress altogether. I think we need to switch away from worrying about whether GDP is going up or down from the point of view of whether it's telling us how well our economy is doing. And I've suggested a few of the elements of what sustainable progress requires. It definitely requires more energy efficiency and resource productivity. By the way, there's been quite a lot of mention in the conference about productivity, always referring to labor productivity as if it's the only productivity that matters. I think that's a mistake. I think productivity can be measured in multiple dimensions, and so resource productivity in the kind of world as I understand it is very, very important. We need to build and maintain community assets. We need to move away from such an emphasis on individual consumption, especially when there's an increasingly a compelling literature which tells us that that kind of activity doesn't improve people's well-being. We need to protect and enhance ecological assets, and we need to develop renewable energy opportunities. Now, I just want to finish my remarks by saying that in order to make this kind of switch in investment, it does raise questions about finance. How do you finance the kind of investment on the right-hand side as opposed to on the left-hand side? The reason it can be quite problematic is because a lot of that kind of investment, particularly things like enhancing and protecting ecological assets, don't generate necessarily financial returns. They generate valuable returns, but not financial returns. And so it poses a challenge to our traditional systems of finance, which are based upon the search for a financial return. How are we going to secure enough investment in our economies to bring this about? And I think this raises questions, important questions, to which I don't have the answer right now, of what the financial system has to be like in order to support this reconfiguring of investment so that we can move towards sustainable progress and away from this overemphasis on traditional economic growth. My final comment is that this graphic, as attractive as it is, has got it all wrong, portraying the kind of person who's going to be making this choice. This is a choice that the young generation of today is going to have to make. And I think all that I can say from somebody who's been working on these kind of issues for rather a long time now is that I think we've got ourselves into a position where we sort of know what the choices are that have to be made. But frankly, these are choices for the next generation to make, and I wish them the best of luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next speaker is Thomas Heller. He's been a lead author of the IPCC report, assessment report, the intergovernmental panel on climate change. I must say that with the kind of winter we have had in North America, it's kind of hard to believe that indeed the weather, the temperatures are warming up, because I was in Florida at the end of January, and everything was frozen on the Emerald Coast next to the Gulf of Mexico. In any case, Thomas has told me that he has never spoken less than 15 minutes. So this will be his first attempt at such a feat. Thomas.
Thanks for the challenge, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first proto-academic conference in 5 years since I left Stanford. So it's a bit daunting. It's a lot easier to deal with the World Bank and IMF than remember what I suffered at the hands of fellow academics. That being said, none of you have ever heard of Climate Policy Initiative. It's a very small nonprofit consultancy. We do not do advocacy. We basically have benefited, like INET, from the support, generous support of George Soros. We work largely in finance and economic issues associated with developmental change, but do so with a particular perspective on the place of natural capital in the development of resources and economies more broadly. Our basic role is to advise governments on the effectiveness of policy. And in this particular case, I am talking both on behalf of my institution, but a larger group who are engaged in a process called the New Climate Economy, which will produce sometime in June a report which in some ways will be seen because of Lord Stern's more peripheral association this time, but as a kind of a second Stern report. And so this is a bit of a tentative preview, disclosure of some of the things we're thinking about, most of which I'm sure will not survive into June after listening to the reactions from people like you or Treasury ministers with whom we met yesterday in Washington. So it's a process that's going on, and very happy to receive comments as well as body language as we go on. Because I have never spoken, as Mark said, for a short, I speak in 50-minute bursts like most academics. I'm going to go through the 6 things that I would have said if I didn't have such a short period of time. So they'll be elliptical, of course, and probably more interesting. And maybe I can go back after I go through the 6 and say something about at least the first couple of them. So here they are. I'm not sure I'll use these slides very much. I only have a few anyway. First thing, you'll always hear talking about, can we get to 2 degrees? That's kind of the scientific standard as to where you suffer major damage if the science is right. I don't think we're talking about that anymore. 2 degrees would be a miracle at this point. We're well on our way to 4 degrees centigrade or more. If we can get back to 2 degrees, that would be absolutely terrific. And that's one of the ways of thinking about this problem. Second major point, we have framed this problem since 1992, which is sadly how long I've been kind of associated with this, as a problem that is essentially a political problem. We are going to devise some kind of policy, presumably driven by the attempt to forestall environmental damages. And we try and take into account, economists have been very important in all of this, thinking about where the benefits of avoided damage cross some putative benefits, putative cost curve. And that has been the framing of the debate for a long time. I would say that in terms of a record, if we think about how we would have imagined a kind of a business as usual or a reference curve in 1992 to a business as usual or a reference curve for climate emissions in 2014, there has been quite a bit of change. A good bit of that has been driven by macroeconomic factors. Probably the principal drivers have been macroeconomic, but politics have played a role in this. It's just that the politics that have driven the change in the curves of what we expect are much more familiar politics than the kinds of sort of radical or revolutionary views of a new environmental politics, environmentally driven politics that would have been more common across the history of this period, especially if you read the work of its advocates. A lot has been done politically. I want to be very clear about that. But it's not how or where it was expected when we thought about these things at the beginning of this process. It does seem to have limits, particularly cost limits, that have to do with the political tolerability of certain levels of economic cost. There have been exceptional cases where nations, and I do mean nations, not international treaties, have gone beyond those limits, which we try to empirically estimate, and these limits can have a global effect, even though they are nationally driven, because they change markets. They change the real economy in many ways, and they also change the way politicians behave, which is very often through example and mimicry. Politicians want to know what works. If something seems to work somewhere, then that changes their capital budgeting procedures if they are finance ministers. And so a very big question that I think we have to ask ourselves in the course of thinking about this problem is, if we have a kind of a revealed preference for change that we can derive empirically by reading the last 22 years of experience, what's going to drive us off that curve? In other words, we're kind of on an enhanced business as usual curve, but that curve is really taking us up toward 4.5 degrees, better than 6, but still presaging, if one accepts the science, a very substantial change. I'd like to say something about that, if I'm able to, in the course of these remarks. How could we reframe it? What could drive things off that pathway? Well, clearly international negotiations of a different character, or a vital spark somehow charging them might do it, or a different perception of damages might do it. Some people in California, my friend Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg and Hank Paulson, think about it that way. I'm not so sure. But one thing that certainly could change it would be real changes in the real economy, structural changes in the real economy, whether they are Schumpeterian in origin. But I think there are certainly signs, and I recognize I have lived my life in Silicon Valley, so you have to discount whatever I say as the normal crazy optimism of people from California. But there are, one of the interesting things about structural change in the economy is that it at least has endogenous character, as we have come to understand it. It is not dependent strictly on political intercession from the outside, and very importantly, it is not climate specific. It is basically driven by other factors which are related to growth and productivity as we read the literature. And we know a lot about structural transformation and structural dynamics. And one of the things that we know is that when we do read the historical record, we find that the political economy of structural change is systemic, it's complex, and it is certainly contingent on a variety of relatively local factors. So in the end, to talk about structural change, even in a Schumpeterian or in a Richard Lester, if we want to be Canadian, sense about this, is a situation in which what we're really talking about is the political economy of environmental politics versus the political economy of growth. In other words, we're not somehow in some technological paradise, as some others may be, saying, new technology, automatic. That's not how structural change takes place. We're talking about two different political economies and trying to understand their internal dynamics. So under this model, what one is really thinking about is the acceleration of the transition of productive systems in food and fuel. Because climate is really nothing more than the byproduct of the way we produce fuel, especially with the forestry industry in global recession due to the decline for paper. What is taking down forests, changing soil composition, is agriculture, the need for food. And so it's about how we produce food, how we use resources, the resource intensity of production, if you will, in the food sector, and then, very importantly, in the agricultural, in the energy sector as well. And let me promise you that if I had time, which I will not attempt to claim, I think I could show you that the political economy of change in agriculture is magnitudes easier than the change in energy. We can talk, I'll just probably say a couple of words about that. But the key is accelerating these transitions, and policy is absolutely necessary in order to do that, because those changes are a combination of using the authority of government and these days combining it with the expertise of the private sector. It also is influenced very much by the changes in the financial system to which you referred. Because if we talked about infrastructure building 35, 40 years ago, it was public sector that built it, often with state banks, state companies, regulated utilities, from which the public regulator removed all of the risk through rate of return controls in this country. But in any case, what we can certainly see is that the questions are about accelerating the rate of transition in these two productive areas. And while we can say a good deal about the nature of the structural changes that are incipient, which are actually visible in the margins of our economy, one thing that we absolutely know from the past, and here I will simply refer to my former sometimes colleague Doug North, these processes, the policies that are necessary to combine with private activity, that anticipate markets, anticipate where markets are going, facilitate that either by getting out of the way, as Elon Musk recently said to a bunch of ministers. They said to him, "What do you need me to do?" He said, "Get out of my way." It's more than that. It is really adjusting systems, finance, institutions that have become adapted to the pre-existing modes of production. So it is not just, it's an active policy role which is needed, but where these policies are actually deployed is something which is event-specific and thereby idiosyncratic. It is historically explicable or locally explicable rather than generally explicable, and it is strategic, certainly in the sense that George Soros talks about strategic behavior as characteristic of financial markets with interactive effects. It's strategic within a larger global system. So in this view, if there are special roles for managing climate risk, it is about the pace and the place in which these transitions take place. And if you were to push me, and I'm willing to be pushed, I would say there are probably three things that really matter. One is what China does about its coal production. Okay? China is the largest investor in renewables in the world. China is also the leading coal producer in the world, and both are growing apace. China's an option player. Which option is going to be in the money, which we won't know until the 2020s, is certainly the biggest question that we have to face as a practical matter. I think agriculture is much easier, but I think Brazil, which will then be reflected in Indonesia and in the southern savanna of Africa, where you do have major possibilities for agricultural expansion as well as productivity gains, will be essential. And the biggest question that we have to face is what I would call loosely energy system transition. Energy system transition means moving from where we are now, where because we have had declining prices for a number of generation technologies, most importantly photovoltaic solar on a distributed basis, and onshore wind, we see very major investments. More than half of what is now being built in the world is in those two categories. But it is entirely within the margins of the current system. In other words, there is no systemic transformation at the present time because the level of intermittency and the level of distributed power, which are inconsistent with the organization of the current energy system, are not disturbed as long as you are at the margins. As you start to approach 33%, which is where Germany is, or Italy, which is more. Sometimes in Italy, the entire load is done through intermittent power, times of the year, times of the day. Denmark, which is able to manage a very deep wind system because it has access to Nord Pool and storage through hydro in Norway and Sweden, becomes an exceptional case in trying to understand how this works. Systems transformation in energy is the question for the whole world, and ultimately for what happens in China as well. That said, we do not know the economics of system costs. We know the economics in the future of generation costs. We do not know the system costs, and the system has to be completely restructured. My last slide, which would have been up here if I were playing with these things. That's okay, I will be finished. My staff goes crazy with these things. I'll just put that up there. The energy system cannot look the way it looks today based around investor-owned or state-owned utilities. You need new asset classes. You need a different structure of political institutions to figure out these complex relationships, all of which are path-dependent from an economic standpoint, between balancing the system, the consumer interface, or shifting load. It's a very complex set of issues, and it is really a system transformation. Now, what do we see? And this will be the final thing. 3 things. System change is difficult. That's what Doug North teaches us. It is improbable. Most countries fail to go down that road. It is not cooperative like the international negotiations. It is competitive in its structure, and it is highly uneven. It also is deeply impeded. If anybody wants to read what I consider to be really first-rate work that we're doing in the NCE, it's to understand the place of stranded assets in moving across a system transition. And on the agricultural side, there are very few stranded assets in the ground. There's not that much capital there. But on the energy side, we probably have $30 to $50 trillion of stranded assets that are new and perfectly good. And who's going to leave them and who's going to bear the distribution costs are the kinds of questions that I think really will determine where this all goes. So let me stop there and try and stay in the 15 minutes. And all these provocative or incomplete remarks, sure we can try and answer in the question session. Thank you.
So thank you, Thomas. Well, we have another Thomas, Thomas Homer Dixon. He is currently writing a book about how humanity can solve all of its problems, no less. He is also well known in Canada because he's been quite critical of our tar sands industry, so much that some journalists in the National Post have been quite nasty with him. I will not tell you how he has been called by these journalists. And for those of you who got the Globe and Mail yesterday in your room, he had a very interesting article in that paper about the dangers of the slowdown in the economy for social stability. So, Thomas, please come.
Thank you very much. Well, as you can see from my first slide here, I'm going to explore for my 15 minutes the relationship between growth, environmental damage, and innovation. On this three-way relationship, I'm not going to look at how environmental damage might induce innovation. That is, of course, a very interesting topic, environmental damage causing price changes, producing new forms of technology that might address that environmental damage. I'm instead going to examine how innovation might loosen the links between growth and environmental damage. Now, this is my third presentation at INET in the last 3 years, and I always start with a bit of expectations management. I am not an economist. I'm a political scientist. So my presentation is going to be somewhat more conceptual than mathematical, somewhat less analytically precise than other presentations you might have heard, grounded and not as grounded in a broad range of economic theory. I think you should take what I'm going to say today as something of a thought experiment, an apparatus that can perhaps open up some very interesting questions. So start by looking at this relationship between growth and environmental damage. This is a relationship that is non-trivially complex. It's an unclear relationship, and it is almost certainly contextually dependent, depending on the particular circumstance of growth and the particular circumstance or kind of environmental damage you're talking about. In thinking about this relationship, though, back in the 1990s, a new concept was coined, drawing on the work of the economist Simon Kuznets in the 1950s and 1960s, who posited an inverted U relationship, as you know, between economic growth reflected in rising per capita income and economic inequality. And the suggestion was made by the authors of these papers, and there's been a lot of writing about it since, that we could think of something that they coined an environmental Kuznets curve, or an EKC, which is an analog of the original Kuznets curve, which looks something like this. Whereas you have rising income per capita, at first you have rising environmental damage. because of industrialization and investment in materially and energetically intensive industry. Society is basically attending to the basic conditions of human well-being during the first part of this curve as you move right. And then at some point, the environmental damage starts to fall because as people become wealthier, they demand politically and economically a cleaner environment. That becomes a concern to them. Also, wealthier economies can invest in the technologies that allow for the protection of the environment, the cleanup of pollution, and also can invest in technological innovation to protect the environment. This is a very controversial idea, but it's not without empirical support. If you look at, for instance, sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States, you see the curve that you have here. There's quite a striking relationship that looks an awful lot like the EKC, or the environmental Kuznets curve that we looked at before. There are a number of other good examples, lead emissions being another. But when you look across a range of pollutants and forms of environmental damage, the story becomes more complex again. For municipal waste, as you see here, increase seems to continue as wealth increases. And then with carbon dioxide emissions per capita, at least in these early data, there didn't seem to be any indication of a leveling off. Now, more recently, we've seen these curves bend down a bit, the two bottom curves, especially the carbon dioxide. But there's not a clear indication that you're actually going to start to decrease. And to the extent that you're seeing a decrease in carbon dioxide emissions at the national level as wealth increases, it may simply be a factor of the export of high-intensity, carbon-intense industries overseas, and then importing the products back into the country, but it's not counted against the national carbon emissions. So the environmental Kuznets curve thesis is enormously controversial. It applies best to local, regional, or national level forms of environmental damage that are visible, that can be seen, and that can be subject to state regulation and policy. Visible, and therefore there's a popular or political demand for them to be fixed. It applies much less well to forms of environmental damage that are global and beyond the purview of any given state, and that are invisible, and so can't be seen. And climate change, of course, is very much that kind of problem. Most importantly, probably the biggest challenge for this thesis is the problem of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, I'm not here to praise the environmental Kuznets curve or to bury it, but I do think that there's value in taking this idea seriously and running with it for a while. There's value because it suggests that there isn't an inevitable positive correlation between wealth and environmental damage, and that we do not have to necessarily make ourselves poor to protect the environment. Wealth may, under some circumstances, and I can stress under some circumstances, be a boon to the environment, not a bane. Well, let's take that idea and see where it leads us, because I think there's some other complexities we have to consider. So as you see here, that I've simply added the kinds of correlations, positive and negative correlation between growth and environmental damage. You have a positive correlation on the upside of the curve and a negative correlation on the opposite side of the curve. In terms of the impact on innovation, one way of thinking about it would be a sort of compression of the curve downwards like this. There are a number of ways innovation could change the position of the curve, but perhaps the most positive would be to forms of innovation that would cause environmental damage to start at a higher income per capita, to reach a lower peak ultimately, and then fall to zero or close to zero sooner. And the point I'd want to emphasize in particular here is the height of the peak is very important, as we'll see in a moment. What we want to do is depress the curve across the full range of incomes, which may imply, frankly, the export of technologies, new forms of technologies from rich countries to poor countries. But the basic idea here is that we shouldn't have to necessarily wait until we're rich to innovate to protect the environment. Probably the most important form of innovation that we can engage in, I think, in order to depress the curve in this way is to pursue various forms of zero carbon energy generation, distribution, and storage, as the other speakers have discussed. Now, but the other part of the problem I want to investigate here is this reverse causal relationship between environmental damage and growth. Now, this is one that gets much less attention, where environmental damage might actually at some point lead to a decline in growth. And I think it's the coupling of these relationships that makes the problem particularly interesting. Now, this particular curve is right out of my fecund imagination, but I think there's some justification for it, as I'll explain. Here I'm simply suggesting that environmental damage, when it becomes serious enough, can have potentially a very serious effect on the generation of wealth and on income per capita. That economies may be fairly robust until the severity of damage is high, and then you get a nonlinear effect, a collapse of income, down to some point where the degradation has diminishing marginal impact on income per capita. Now notice here that we have environmental damage as the independent variable. Income per capita is the dependent variable, so things are reversed. And the forms of the impact, and I could go on at length, this is where actually being a political scientist might be particularly useful, but the forms of impact are many and varied, and many of them are mediated by the political system and political processes. Damage to infrastructure and capital stock arising from extreme climate events. These costs are already high and increasing as climate change worsens. Health impacts of pollution, water and air pollution, and also again of extreme weather and climate events. And particularly important, I think, are going to be shocks to the food system. Global and national food systems that restrict availability of food, sharply raise the prices of food, and induce political instability. And political stability is an essential precursor to growth and economic well-being. And to the extent that the environment is undermining that political stability, then it will have an impact on wealth production and income per capita. Now, this is an area where I've done a considerable amount of research over a number of years, going back more than 2 decades. And there's been a burst of research recently looking at the climate implications of climate change for political instability around the world. This is controversial research, but there is significant evidence that environmental stress, in combination with various other social institutional factors, can produce civil breakdown and significant impacts on economies. Now, what kind of shift in the curve would we see if we innovated in this case? In this case, what you want to do is reduce the impact of environmental damage on income per capita. You could harden, or maybe I should have said, you can make your infrastructure smarter in various ways. For example, if you're talking about technical innovation, you can make your electricity grids more resilient in the face of extreme heat waves. You could have medical interventions that would reduce the health impacts of, say, water and air pollution. You could make your food systems much more resilient to heat shock. Very large percentage of human protein comes from grains. Almost all those grains are extremely susceptible to relatively short periods of high temperatures. The global food system is very vulnerable. We're investing only a fraction of what we should be investing in research to respond to what is very clearly almost certain change in the climate regime for our crops over coming decades. So here we've closed the loop. And you can, in a sense, bring these two curves together. In this case, what I've done is I've flipped the red one around. Again, for the red one, the independent variable is on the vertical axis and the dependent variable is on the horizontal axis now. And this produces something of an interesting result. You have an equilibrium point where the two curves intersect, the first intersection there on the left-hand side, which can actually, I think, make the right-hand part of the curve of the environmental Kuznets curve, the inverted U, inaccessible. So we'll take a look at that. Those of you who do this kind of thing a lot know exactly, I think, what I mean. But the rising income per capita produces a level of environmental damage that in turn produces a drop in income per capita from T2, from T1 to T2 and then to T3. And T3 suggests that as the economy contracts, you have lower environmental damage. But you're going to get stuck at that intersection. So the question is, is this entirely realistic? And I would suggest that maybe we're starting to see a situation in China that might look a bit like this, and that we are at risk of China not being able to reach ultimately the right side of this environmental Kuznets curve. So now I'm just going to show some photographs. You've heard about it. You know about environmental damage in China. But really, in some ways, photographs and pictures do say 1,000 words. The situation is really quite extraordinary there. We may be seeing the first major economy that is starting to encounter a broad range of environmental limits to growth. This is Shanghai, Pudong. Significant health effects from air pollution in the country, causing heavy illness burden in the economy. And now we know a flight of high-quality human capital from major cities, including Beijing. People just don't want to live there. They don't want to raise their children there anymore. And so they leave. They do what they can to get out. The overall economic burden to China of this environmental damage is difficult to estimate. You see a wide range of estimates, but it's at least 2 to 3% of GDP, and it may be as high as 10% of GDP. It's also causing widespread protests, public protests across the country. It's over 10 years since China published publicly its annual protest figures, when they reached about 60,000 protests a year. And they haven't published that data for a long time. But many of those, and you can certain that there are many more now, are protests against various kinds of environmental degradation, siting of factories, local pollution. So it has a progressive delegitimization effect on the regime. Of great importance, too, is the decline in precipitation in the northern part of the country, which is quite possibly a function of the weakening of the East Asian monsoon, which blows from the South China Sea northwards. As it becomes weaker, it tends to drop more water in the southern part of the country in the Yangtze River, as you can see there. And you know about the rising incidence of floods along the Yangtze. But just as significantly, it drops less water in the northern part of the country, and there's now a progressive desiccation of the northern part of the country, which is one of the most important grain-producing regions of the country. You can see the declining flow of the Yellow River there, which is partly a function of less precipitation and also a function of larger withdrawals of water from the river. And this desiccation in the northern part of the country is making the country extremely vulnerable to the food shock, a matter of great concern to Chinese officials at this point. Then the economic impacts of environmental degradation will probably not be incremental. The impacts on China may come in the form of a series of significant climate events that compress its food production ability, have a major destabilizing effect on the society, and then in turn a consequence for its economic well-being. Yep. So just to conclude, well, I have one more slide here. This is not just a problem that's contained in China. There are major global externalities. Here's a shot of the miasma in the atmosphere of China spreading across towards Korea there, Japan in the distance, and then ultimately all the way across the Pacific. Just to conclude, the two directions of innovation I'm suggesting could actually help separate these curves and could remove that kind of blockage that I was suggesting might occur at that intersection. But it's not going to happen at the level of innovation we're seeing right now. We need a massive increase in public and private investment in order to avoid the kind of trap that I've identified here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Thomas. We had an economist, and we had an economist who's also a lawyer, then we had a political scientist. Now we're going to have a geologist or a geophysicist. Daniel Schrag has very kindly agreed to replace Amartya Sen. Daniel has been working for a long time on the evolution of climate change through the past, on the impact that humans have on the current climate change and on the future climate change. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Indeed, about 10 days ago, Rob Johnson asked me to fill in for Amartya Sen, a bit of a challenge here on this panel. Amartya and I are starting on some work together on energy choices for India, in particular questions about nuclear power in India. But I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to do is talk about a slightly different perspective from my other panelists, although it'll resonate a little bit with what Tom Heller said. I want to talk about timescale, because as a geologist, I think a lot about timescale. And I think you actually have some insights about the nature of this problem if you think about some of the timescales here. And I'll try to keep this very brief and to the point. So this is the famous Keeling curve. I had a longer set of slides on this. I'm not going to go through them. I simply want to remind people that the carbon cycle of the Earth has very long time constants. Roughly half of the CO2 we emit from burning fossil fuel is taken, a little less than half is taken out by the ocean and the land over pretty much right away. But what's left, 50% will still be here 1,000 years from now, and 25% will still be here 20,000 years from now. Okay? It's radically different than nuclear waste. Nuclear waste, roughly, in 1,000 years, roughly roughly 0.1% of the radioactive energy will still be there in terms of the harm. Here, 20,000 years from now, you'll still have roughly a quarter of the problem. They're very long time constants. There are also long time constants associated with ice sheets and the demise of ice sheets, with sea level rise, with the warming of the oceans. It's not even as simple as fixing that system. For example, I've been working with colleagues on perhaps technology to change the radiation budget of the Earth, engineer it, and fix the climate system. But even that doesn't really fix it, because there's all this heat that's already been put into the ocean, melting going on in the ice sheets. So you can't, these are strictly non-reversible. So it's a little more complicated than that. There's one other important point I want to make about the climate system for economists here, and that is that what really matters is cumulative emissions. It's a simple point that a lot of people say they know, but very few people, when we talk about climate policy, actually show that they understand this point. The climate system is remarkably insensitive to specific emissions trajectories. What it cares about is the cumulative emissions over a timescale of a century or more. Now, this is a paper by Miles Allen from Oxford that showed this very elegantly, but this has been reproduced many, many times. The important point here is that short-term carbon emissions really don't matter. Yes, of course carbon matters. You want to get to zero, but it's about getting to zero, and what happens in 2020 or 2030, carbon is a very imperfect metric of progress. So you can have some very perverse policies trying to get some 2020 or 2030 carbon standards, some carbon emission reduction, and actually not doing much about the big picture, which I would argue is likely to be in terms of encouraging innovation. So this is why, from a very sort of plain and simple language perspective, politics of climate are so hard, okay? Nothing we do in terms of changing emissions over the next 30 years is going to materially affect our experience of climate change in the next 30 years. That isn't to say we won't be affected by climate change. We will be affected by climate change. Can't tell you how exactly, but I promise you we will. The question, but It's already dialed in, okay? We can modestly, in our actions over the next 30 years, affect our experience of climate 30 to 60 years out, and significantly affect our experience 60 years out to 100 years and well beyond that. But think about that for a second. We're talking about paying significant costs up front for benefits that accrue to grandchildren and beyond. This is fundamentally a generational challenge. And people sometimes just miss that point. Or they sell this in a false way. They say, well, if we only take action now, you can protect yourself from climate change. Not exactly. You can protect your grandchildren a little bit. Okay, quickly, I've been working on energy technology and policy for the last 15 years or so. This is a chart showing world energy from 1800 to 2008. You can see this incredible change, the Industrial Revolution. This is the history of the industrial world you're looking at. It's a remarkable slide. One of the things that's impressive, though, is the timescale of innovation. You know, I often hear talks about innovation where people talk about high-tech or biotech, and wow, 10 years ago, everybody had phones with landlines, and now, you have houses that don't have telephone lines going into them. And boy, couldn't that happen in the energy system? Imagine what could happen 10 years from now. Well, let's take a deep breath. The truth is that the timescales for innovation and change in the energy system are very long, and this is sort of what Tom Heller was talking about. It's partly because these are massive infrastructure systems. Think about it this way. The steam engine, 1786. It took almost 150 years for coal to surpass wood as the dominant source of world energy. It's incredible, right? And the truth is, timescales of energy transitions are inherently long because we're talking about infrastructure measured in tens of trillions of dollars, and we're talking about enormous engineering challenges. Now, here's a nice example. Where I live in Massachusetts, the dominant energy industry 150 years ago was whaling. People went out and hunted whales and brought the blubber back for oil. This is a wonderful cartoon from Vanity Fair from 1861. It shows the grand ball given by the whales in honor of discovery of oil in Pennsylvania. It's funny partly because it's true. Remember, what saved the whales was not the fact that we felt bad about killing whales. We stopped hunting whales because oil was a cheaper and better alternative. Okay? There's a lesson there that's fundamental. I wish this weren't true, and maybe people know how to change people's attitudes and behaviors in a way that can change this equation, but somehow I feel like if we came back 100 years from now and we had the climate problem mostly in hand, it would be because there would be a series of disruptive innovations that would dramatically have changed our energy systems because they were better. They took over and displaced fossil systems because they were better. Better includes cheaper, but is not only cheaper. That is, there are other external costs that sometimes we care about, like air pollution, some of the pictures that Tad was just showing from China. I think there's a fundamental lesson here. So what about timescale? I've been teaching a course for many years with graduate students, undergraduates, about 7 or 8 years, where I force people to design a non-fossil, it's actually not even a non-fossil, it's an 80% reduction relative to 2005 by 2050. It's Obama's climate goal by 2050. This used to be US cap. There are versions of it for the world, for Germany, for the UK. We do the US because it's easier to project what demand is going to be by 2050. If you try to do this for the world, there's so much uncertainty in what you consider for growth rates that the whole problem blows up on you. So we do the US, and we make students design a low-carbon economy for the US. Sector-specific, transportation, industry, commercial, residential. It's a really hard problem. It's a structurally hard problem. And until you actually work with the numbers, you don't really understand the nature of this transition. And what you end up concluding, and a little bit what Tom was talking about, it's really hard. You need lots of different innovations, and they're trade-offs. that people don't think about. For example, if you want to get rid of jet fuel and diesel fuel, you're unlikely to be able to replace them with electricity, and so you need biomass, massive amounts of biomass. And there's a huge land use trade-off between land use and CO2 emissions. If you want to get rid of liquid fuels, you're going to have to create them with massive amounts of biomass, which requires huge increases in land use. That's the nature of the problem. But the general, outside of diesel and jet fuel, there's a general pattern, which is you electrify everything you can, because you can't have distributed emissions from fuel. So when you do that, it turns out you need to build massive electricity systems. The reason is, in the US, depending on your assumptions about energy efficiency, you somewhere between triple and quintuple the electricity demand in the US, because you're electrifying half the transportation sector, a big part of the industrial sector, all the commercial and residential heating that's currently supplied by natural gas. So you're electrifying everything, you increase electricity demand like crazy. And if we're very conservative, meaning we're taking very high rates of efficiency gains and everything, you end up with numbers like something like 1,500 gigawatt years, which is roughly a tripling of current electricity demand. And the problem is, if you want to include renewables, renewables have incredibly low capacity factors. German solar, for example, they're 18% solar. Anybody know what the capacity factor for solar in Germany is right now? It's 7%. So what that means is you need massive capacity. So we're talking about minimum 5,000 gigawatts of new electricity capacity built by 2050. Currently, we're building at about 13 to 15 gigawatts per year. So just do the math. It's not even close. 2050 is a total pipe dream. We're never going to be at 80% below by 2050. And if you do the numbers yourself, you'll understand that. So what does that mean? I mean, it sort of reinforces what Tom said about forget 2 degrees, we're heading to 4, maybe 6. And that's true. Let me give you a perspective on timescale. For China, they're building at about 80 gigawatts of new capacity in the electricity sector per year. Most of it coal, but a lot of wind and solar, but still tiny relative to coal. Now, it would take us about 30 years to industrialize, to build the steel mills and the cement plants to be able to build that fast. So we'd have to ramp up for 30 years before we could get to 80 gigawatts a year of construction. But if we did that, then we would only take us another 60 years or so. So in about 100 years, massive political will, favorable economics, huge industrial effort, building at the rate of China. And by the way, I've assumed we've innovated to the point where we have solved the storage problem and the intermittency problem. So this assumes perfect technology, and it only takes us 100 years to get there. That's just for the US. This is a global problem, so we have to get everybody else to do it too. So I'm sorry to sound a little pessimistic, but if you look at the numbers and you're realistic about the numbers, this is a much harder problem than the UN tells you. It's a much more difficult problem. And some of the political goals you hear about are just not credible. This is going to be a long transformation. I think there's lessons in that, actually. I think there's important lessons. There's a question about the distant future. How do we value the distant future? And this is an issue I've been talking about with Amartya. I think before I go there, though, and I'll just conclude there, but I want to just make this very clear. We're talking about a fundamentally long transition, and there are long time scales in the climate system, and we have to think about how we deal with those. And for me, one of the lessons is what really matters is creating market conditions that support disruptive innovation. That's the bottom line. Now, you could have a carbon tax. You could have EPA regulations that shut down coal plants in the US because that'll spur massive investment in other energy systems. Frankly, what really matters is the market conditions that support disruptive innovation, but there's a potential for a backlash. So the German massive investment in renewables has raised electricity prices to the point where they're on the verge of a massive political backlash, and that will hurt. So there's a balancing act here. It's really tough, but fundamentally, it's about innovation and encouraging innovation, but doing it in a way that doesn't create the kind of political backlash, because you have to sustain this. So in terms of the time scale, distant future, here's a figure showing discount rate after 40 years. But you can quickly do the math. 100 years or 150 years is ridiculous, right? any kind of exponential discount rate, if you're talking about damages that are far out, you essentially are counting them as worthless. Now, there's a whole literature on hyperbolic discounting and how this makes more sense. And there's a big behavioral economics literature looking at this, asking people what they care about in terms of the distant future. But I actually think there's a more fundamental shift needed towards a political theory and political philosophical approach to this. I just want to end with this quote from Amartya's book, From the Idea of Justice. He says, if the importance of human lives lies not merely in our living standard and need fulfillment, but also in the freedom that we enjoy, then the idea of sustainable development has to be correspondingly reformulated. There is cogency in thinking not just about sustaining the fulfillment of our needs, but more broadly about sustaining or extending our freedom, including the freedom to meet our needs. Thus, recharacterized, sustainable freedom can be broadened from the formulations proposed by Brundtland and Solow to encompass the preservation and, when possible, expansion of the substantive freedoms and capabilities of people today without compromising the capability of future generations to have similar or more freedoms. I think there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done on this, thinking about the value of the distant future, because we are making choices today that will affect the Earth for tens of thousands of years. And we tend to devalue those things for obvious reasons, but I think there's some fundamental reasons why we need to think very carefully about those choices. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Obviously, you're used to speak for 15 minutes because you were 15 minutes right on the dot. Given that it's 12 past 6 and that this session is supposed to finish at 6:30, I think it would be appropriate to get right away to questions from the audience. We had 3 pessimistic presentations, I would conclude, and one that was half optimistic and half pessimistic. Right, so let's go with, is there the micro? So here it comes. So there's a question here, second question there, third question in the back, and a fourth question in the very back. So I'll try to remember. So you're number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Yes?
So my question is, we didn't hear anything about meat production. So fortunately, India is vegetarian. Are they going to stay that way? And China is mostly vegetarian, but might not stay that way. Will the food system collapse and we'll all become vegetarians, or are we going to have to force some people to become vegetarians?
Anybody wants to?
I mean, there's no question that meat requires more grain, ultimately, and grain requires more water. But will it collapse? I mean, this is where hopefully markets should work, right? I think ultimately meat will get a lot more expensive because it requires a lot more grain if food prices go up, and we'll see. I mean, I'm much more worried about something that Tad referred to, which is the disruptions associated with a heat wave like the 2010 Russia heat wave, where Russia shut down its exports of grain. In 2012 in the U.S., horrible heat and drought. Corn set, record prices. And to me, the real danger there is the breakdown of markets, because so many countries now depend on food markets. And the worry that I have is the breakdown of markets under crisis. It was just a few years ago that Vietnam and India stopped exporting rice because of the food crisis. And that's exactly the worst thing that can happen.
Tad? Oh, everybody wants to. Tad, go first.
Very quickly on this, there's a very clear relationship between meat consumption and income, rising income. And it seems to be difficult to decouple meat consumption from rising income. And to the extent that meat consumption rises, then our global food system is going to become probably less resilient in coming decades. We're rising to a population of around 10 billion people. With increased meat consumption, we may have to double, even triple total global food production. And there's some really serious questions about whether we can do that in a rapidly changing climate regime. So the risk of shocks in a situation, in a tight coupled global grain market, in a situation where you're pushing right against the limits with populations eating a lot of meat and 10 billion people, the risks of cascading failures as a result of heat shocks of the kind Dan was just mentioning is going to be extremely high. I actually don't think, and this gets directly to your question, I don't think we can avoid a serious conversation about some value change here and whether such high levels of meat consumption should accompany wealth. And I think there is a conversation going on in some quarters of wealthy societies about lowering meat consumption, but that's not happening, from what I understand, in the rapidly growing middle classes of India and China.
So,
Can I just say one thing? I'm not worried about that. We work very heavily in Brazil. You got 200 million hectares in pasturage. It's average 1 cow per hectare. Take 100 hectares, take half of that and put it into soy. Leave the other at 4 to 5 cows per hectare, which you can do on grass-fed stuff without even going to industrial production. I don't think that's one of the main issues we should be worried about.
Peter, do you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to add one other thing. I mean, we've talked in our different ways about the need for a very significant transformation, and Tad just mentioned that should involve also a consideration of values. So when I think about vegetarianism, I think about it in at least 3 ways. People become vegetarians partly because of their own interest in their own health. Some do. Some are concerned about their footprint, all that goes into providing animals with their food so that we can eat them, which I think is what you were alluding to. And thirdly, there's the ethical dimension. Some people become vegetarians because they take an interest in the welfare of the animals. And I think this is a very interesting angle because I think it speaks to the need to rethink our relationship to nature. I think the kind of transformation that's been flirted with in this conversation so far about how we're going to make changes, significant changes over the next 100 years in a way that doesn't necessarily detract from human well-being, in fact can enhance human well-being, but human well-being will have to be understood in rather different terms from the way we understand it today.
Okay, thank you. So this was a very popular question for our speakers. The second question here.
Thank you. The biggest innovation in energy in recent decades has been fracking natural gas, tight oil. Undersea methane hydrates may become commercially viable in the next decade or so. So this scenario of a near infinite supply of very cheap fossil fuels on the one hand could clearly be a disaster. On the other hand, one could argue it's an opportunity to wipe out coal, which we have to do in relatively short time frames. Be interested in the panel's view on which side of that debate they come down, and if there is an opportunity to use gas to wipe out coal, how might we do it without wiping out renewables as well? Thanks.
Go ahead.
So I 2 years ago, I wrote a Daedalus article called "Is Shale Gas Good for Climate Change?" that asked just that question. And you got it right. Although I think, again, the bottom line is, what is it doing for the market for disruptive innovation? I think that's the key metric again. In the US, shale gas, people supporting it on the climate side have said it lowers emissions because it's shutting down coal plants. There's another group, a minority, that says, well, it's bad because of natural gas emissions. I think you've actually got it right, where suddenly you've created a whole bunch more fossil fuel that's really cheap, and therefore you've moved the goalposts, right? You've made it more difficult for solar and wind and other technologies to compete. And that's the dominant effect, I would argue, from a climate perspective so far. Unconventional gas in the US has killed investment in solar and wind. And it's been really hard because $3 or $4 gas in the US makes everything else much more difficult. Now, what's the silver lining? The silver lining is exactly what you said. I would argue that without unconventional gas, President Obama would never have proposed EPA regulation the way he did. 10 years ago, if you said we're going to put rules in that will essentially shut down every existing coal plant in the US, if they're ultimately taken effect, that would have been politically ridiculous because it was 50% of our electricity and you had no alternative. Now you have an alternative, and therefore it enables possibilities. So It's not about just competing with coal, though. It's about enabling an opportunity to put in a policy that encourages the market for innovation. And taking advantage of, frankly, the political battle. Frankly, fighting, this is just a strategy question that maybe Tad can comment on as a political scientist. I've been saying for a long time, attacking coal and oil and gas at the same time is hopeless. These are the biggest industries in the world, politically, in the US. But actually using gas, which is the big winner of climate legislation, ironically, to kill coal, not just hurt it, kill it. That's an interesting battle, and it's an interesting political strategy.
Okay, maybe we'll go with the third question in the back, which was in the back there.
Hi, I'm wondering if the panel can comment on the potential of two controversial technologies to address some of the challenges you guys mentioned, specifically in terms of energy transformation, the systemic energy transformation, and the dangers of climate change. The first would be a huge uptake in nuclear energy and the potential of climate engineering or geoengineering to reverse or fight some of the worst effects of climate change.
Sure. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Actually, I just want to say I'm not nearly so worried. The coal gas spreads in the U.S. are very close, so it's being taken out by gas, right? As exactly as Dan just said. I don't think it's going to have much impact on renewables because we seem to be willing to pay around the world 3.8, 3.9 cents a kilowatt hour more for renewables that are in that area. The spread between renewables and gas or coal, the U.S. won't matter. I think in China, that's a big question. On the energy system transition, I mean, nuclear is just extremely expensive. It's a good baseload fuel. You can pour it into the system as the system stands. So it has value. I have trouble seeing a really deep low carbon system without some nuclear in there. On the other hand, it's expensive as hell right now because we have new safety standards. Nuclear is an area where we've seen costs rise, and it's just very expensive at the present time. If the Chinese think they can bring it in at half the cost, the way some people do, let's see what happens when the actual costs come in. I think the most interesting changes in the system are not in the geoengineering or the nuclear side. I think it's in the application of things that we see going on every day in the transformation of the rest of the economy, namely the application of information control systems, which shift our capacity to do load shifting, which are being represented in the real market. I mean, the reason Google pays $3.2 billion for Nest is to get inside the house control system to tie it up to rapid control systems on the outside. Okay. The reason why Tesla is of value is because the material science work it's doing on batteries. I think the changes are things that we already see going on in other major, what a lot of economists would call general purpose technologies. And the interesting thing is their use applications in energy, a lot more than I'm prepared to turn for energy system transition to either a very high cost, politically sensitive fuel like nuclear, although I said I think it has a place, or to something like geoengineering, about which I would happily turn to Daniel or someone else I watched the Chinese take drones up into the clouds over Beijing and distribute silver oxide. Something in my stomach has difficulty with that.
Right. Tad, just a short...
I largely agree with what has been said here. The only thing I'd add in response to Eric's comment is, and it relates to the one at the back, is that I think this fracking boom that we're seeing in the United States is actually going to be relatively short-lived, 10, 15, 20 years at the outside. There's only one major field right at the moment, Marcellus Field, that hasn't peaked and started to decline. There's some serious questions about whether Bakken can continue to increase its production indefinitely, as folks claim it should. So I think what the United States faces right now is a situation roughly similar to, say, Britain with its North Sea reserves, which will last a certain period of time and then will go into irretrievable decline. But I agree that this is a golden moment to do the job on coal while natural gas is really cheap, because it's not actually going to be cheap for that long.
All right. The very last question of the session, and perhaps just one of you can reply to this question, and then we'll be through. Yes?
Some of the slides that Daniel Schrack showed us made one argue that we are having here a problem that doesn't have a technological fix. And we actually, it's sort of a tragedy of the commons. And given that the energy consumption distribution worldwide and also the emission distribution has a Gini coefficient from over 0.5, what prospects do you see in these negotiations about reductions for some sort of ethical arguments to have some influence? Thanks.
Negotiations. I guess it may not surprise you from my comments. I tend to not watch the negotiations too carefully. There seems to be a very European view, which is that nations come together, agree to certain targets, and then they go meet them. And of course, that's not actually what happened in Kyoto, right? Germany agreed to meeting a target that it had already essentially met because they knew reunification was going to happen and they were going to shut down East Germany. The UK agreed to a target it had already met because Margaret Thatcher shut down the coal industry before the negotiations. So they were just smarter. The US agreed to a ridiculous target it could never meet, and therefore it was never ratified. So to me, the lesson is that isn't actually how change takes place. It's not through negotiation. I'm not saying that international negotiations don't put some political pressure on countries to do things, but I guess the whaling picture to me brought home the fundamental lesson that it's about disruptive innovation that spreads because it's cheaper and better. And ultimately, we need not just one innovation, but we need lots of them across the energy space. Maybe in storage, maybe in, as Tom says, I think the information technology applied to electricity management is a really interesting space. I'll give you another one. I think in 10 years, maybe sooner, we're going to have fast charging batteries. Right now, a Tesla is basically a $25,000 car with a $50,000 battery because you need a 300-mile battery. But imagine if you only needed an 80-mile battery because you could charge in 1 minute, and that was all over. That's coming.
2 years.
You think it's 2 years? Okay. But there's a disruptive innovation because suddenly now a Tesla costs $40,000 and it's pretty much as nice as a $40,000 Audi. And so now you've got an interesting competition and it has some advantages too. So I think those are the sort of surprise disruptions that will come about. You won't think about them as energy disruptions, but they will profoundly change the energy world.
All right, so many thanks to our 4 experts who made this session very interesting. Thank you also for the questions.